Hello, everyone, and welcome to our week 3 of organizational theory. I hope that so far these last couple of weeks have been fun and interesting, and that we are learning new things, um, and that the class is living up to the expectations. Again, if you have any questions uh, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email or via WhatsApp, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions or or help you in any way that I can. Okay, so for this week we are talking. Uh, we're going to be talking about an organization's design and structure, and looking at some of the elements and the challenges that come with organizational design. Looking at some of the pros and cons, and looking at some of the trade-offs that we have to make when we have organizations, and the trade-offs that organizations and managers have to make when managing in an organization. So let's get started. So for this week, for the readings, for this week you had readings. You had chapter 4 and you had chapter 5. So I'm going to provide with today's lecture with an overview and a quick, as comprehensive as I can, lecture on the most important and key topics in chapter 4 and chapter 5. So let's talk about organizational design here for a minute. The first concept that we have to talk about is differentiation. Okay, and differentiation is the process by which an organization allocates people and resources to organizational tasks. It's how an organization uh, divides its tasks, divides its labor. Okay, um, and, uh, and it's very important because how it divides its labor has a great deal to do with how effective and efficient it is to achieve the outcome that it seeks to achieve. Now, uh, that division of labor depends on whether an organization is a simple organization or whether an organization is a complex organization. So, in a simple organization, differentiation is low because that division of labor is low. So you have, say, for example, one person or a few people performing all of the tasks. This is very common in your the family business, for example, where you have, say, mom and pop, and maybe the kids, when they get old enough, they join the business, and so that's a simple organization where you have somebody being the manager and being the messenger, and being, wearing many hats, so to speak. So that's a simple organization. Then you have a complex organization, and this is where differentiation is high because obviously division of labor is high. So this would be very common, say for example, a firm like Apple, for example, or General Motors. Okay, so these big organizations are very complex. Okay, very differentiated. Now, differentiation um, also has to do with the, 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 the different uh, the different levels. Okay, for example, if you look at the building blocks of differentiation, we have here in this image, you have an outer square that we don't we don't define, but you can consider that outer square as the external environment. Okay, so that external environment obviously has an impact, or does impact the organization. So think about that external environment, and then you start differentiating. So the organization, the outer, the second square is the organization. The organization is divided up or differentiated by divisions. Within the division, it is differentiated by functions, and within those functions, or to achieve those functions, you have to assign roles. So this is how an organization looks like, and these are the building blocks, so to speak, of differentiation. Let's talk a little bit more about some of these subunits. We talked about, so we said that you have, let me go back to the square. So we said that you have organization, made up of divisions. Those divisions are broken down into functions, and then those functions are achieved by individuals acting on different roles. So let's look at the functions part, okay? The functions, you have support functions, for example, production functions, maintenance functions, adaptive functions, managerial functions. These are all different types of functions that make up the subunits of an organization. Organizations can also be differentiated based on whether they are vertical or horizontal. So if you picture a vertical organization, it is a top-down, okay, very, very centralized, very vertical. You see these types of organizations, for example, when you in countries that have totalitarian regimes are very vertical, okay, whereas countries that have democratic regimes or democratic systems, I should say, those tend to be much more horizontal. So that's kind of gives you an idea about vertical versus horizontal. So in an organization, it's either an organization that is very vertical, not widespread, or one that is horizontal. Okay, so in a vertical or vertical differentiation, the way that the organization is designed, or the way that an organization designs its hierarchy and creates these relationships is top down. Okay, whereas the horizontal, you do have a person at the head, and that person has people right underneath, and then those people have many persons underneath themselves. So it spreads out. The horizontal spreads out into functions, into subunits, functions, divisions, where there are many roles to be played, whereas the vertical organization doesn't have that many roles, okay? Now, integration, okay? This is another illustrator, or another describer, I should say, of organizations. Integration is the process by which organizations coordinate tasks or functions or whatever they do, whatever an organization does. And so when we think about integration, it's think about how well how a machine, and here you see gears, right? So it's the gears, and how well knit and closely knit and well oiled this machine is. This is determined by integration. It's the coordination, okay, organization, coordination of tasks and functions, and one department working with another, and one team working with another. This is integration. So you can imagine that integration becomes a very important part of an organization, and it drives organizational efficiency. When you don't have integration, you end up with organizations that are kind of just throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to figure things out. Maybe you end up with people doing multiple things. So I'm doing the same thing you are. So we end up doing the same thing. We are not being efficient. There are too many people working on the same task. There are multiple people doing the same role, so you end up with people fighting, and somebody might believe that their way is the way, and so you end up with conflict, right? So integration becomes a very important element in organizations, because without it, it can lead to a loss of efficiency. It can lead to conflict. It can lead to internal battles. And so you want to have an organization that is very effectively integrated. What are some of the integration mechanisms that we might have in an organization? Okay, so for example, you might have a team, obviously, right? The basic one that we are very used to. A team. You have a different role, like a liaison role, where you are, say, the coordinator or the link between, say, maybe you are the speaker. The speaker or the spokesperson, right? Or the manager. The manager meets with the supervisors, and the supervisors meet with the team. That's the kind of integrating mechanisms that organizations should have and need to have. Now, when we talk about integration, we necessarily have to talk about differentiation, because integration is bringing everything together, bringing everybody into the loop, and trying to coordinate all of the different tasks, roles, and activities. On the other hand, differentiation is actually a little bit in the opposite direction. It's assigning individuals, teams, groups, assigning them specific roles and giving them their own responsibility and their own tasks to achieve those by themselves, not necessarily integrated. Now, with organizations, you need both. At times, you need some differentiation, and at times, you do need to have integration. In other words, there should be integration in a global sense, and everybody should understand what everybody's doing. But at some point, you also need to have differentiation at some level and in some tasks and some roles, because if you don't, you're going to end up with, say, everybody doing the same thing, or multiple people doing the same thing. You might end up with conflict. You might end up with internal fighting. Maybe one group thinks that their project should be the one that should be featured, right? And so you need to assign responsibilities and roles within the organization, and this is part of differentiation. Okay. There's also centralization versus decentralization. We are very used to this in our jobs, and we've seen it throughout. We see it in the public sector, we see it in the private sector, we see it in many different arenas in society, where you hear the words centralized, or a centralized government, decentralized government, okay, or a decentralized authority, or decentralization of authority. What are the pros and what are the cons? Well, obviously, an organization that is vertical tends to be much more centralized. So the boss, right? The boss is at the top. Now, when the boss is a type of person that has a problem with, say, delegating. This is a problem with leadership sometimes, that there are these great managers at the top, but they seem to have a hard time delegating authority, because they fear that if they delegate, they won't get the results they want. So these types of situations usually produce very centralized organizational structures and cultures. On the other hand, when you depend and promote delegating authority, and separation of tasks and assigning different roles, you end up with a decentralized organization, usually which is one that features, say, for example, a a middle manager. Okay, middle managers, lower managers. Okay, this allows the upper management to to give to provide guidance, and then let the middle managers and the lower managers lead, manage, and execute the objectives of the organization by themselves. You are essentially empowering them to do so without micromanaging, right? We've heard that expression before. Micromanagers tend to kind of get in the way sometimes, and if you know, the literature will tell you, and you might have heard this too, that those that micromanage, those managers that don't give you the opportunity to be creative and to really take ownership of your job and of your role. When you have those types of managers, it trunks creativity. It leads to burnout. It leads to disappointment, and people sometimes end up leaving the organization because they feel that they are not given the opportunity to really fulfill their full potential, right? So it's a balancing, a balancing act that organizations have to play. Okay, there's also another trade-off and another balancing act, and that has to do with standardization and mutual agreement. Okay, which of the two should the organization follow? Which of the two paths, or which of the two structures and frameworks should it employ? Should it seek to standardize its systems, its behavior, or should it seek a much more of a mutual agreement type of a culture? Standardization is about conforming to specific models of behavior, different actions, different ways of doing things. Usually, you have, for example, when you think standardization, when you think of standardization, you might think of, say, what is the job description? Okay, how do we perform this task? Okay, well, this task is performed in the following way, and it's all standardized. Okay, so very much constrained and defined by rules and norms. Okay, now the difference is mutual agreement. This is the compromise that emerges when decision making and coordination evolve. Okay, they evolve from people's individual judgment and their managing of the situation. So, which of the two is preferred? The answer to that is they are both preferred. It just depends on the situation, because there are going to be some times when the situation calls for a mutual agreement type of management strategy or a management approach, where you need to allow somebody to be creative. As we say, think outside the box, because we cannot always depend on the set rules, the standardized rules, because if we do that, then we might never get a different result, right? Einstein said, don't expect to get a different result by doing the same thing. Well, that's kind of the idea. There are some situations that call for situational leadership, that call for creative leadership, that call for you going outside the box and thinking differently, and maybe employing a new strategy that is not standard, that is not what's been used before. So you're going to be in situations that do need that, and so it's important that we keep that ace under our sleeve, but also it's important that organizations do standardize certain things, because standardization leads to efficiency, reduces noise, reduces costs of not knowing, right? If everything is standard, you tend to have less less problems of, sorry, I have something in my eye, less problems of not knowing, right? Because I'll give you an example. Starbucks in China and Starbucks in San Francisco, there is a certain degree of standardization that is required from Starbucks in China versus Starbucks in San Francisco. So when you go to Starbucks in China, there are expectations about product image, quality, the physical setting, etc. Everything is standardized. Think about what would happen to the image and to the product branding if you walked into Starbucks in China and it wouldn't look the same. Well, then if it didn't look the same, then the customer doesn't perceive it as the same. If you get the coffee and a whatever macchiato, whatever you order, doesn't taste the same as you are accustomed to in the US or somewhere else, then there is no standardization. The only way, however, to ensure that that product will taste exactly the same is by standardizing your processes, your mixes, your product design, your marketing. So there needs to be some standardization as well because it reduces risk, reduces confusion. All of this leads to greater certainty for the organization, and the organization is able to function much more efficiently. Okay. For and continuing on with this idea to formalization, right? The written rules. Okay. Organizations need rules, right? We need rules. We depend on rules. We depend on norms, and these are the formal building blocks of an organization. We call them institutional building blocks, right? Regulative, normative, and the cultural cognitive elements that make up, in fact, institutions. And many institutions or many organizations end up institutionalizing, going through institutionalization processes. So the regulative, the normative, and the cultural cognitive elements, these are building blocks. So you have formalization. Now, socialization is when the members of the organization learn the norms of the organization and internalize these unwritten rules, okay, and actually make them their own. This is what we call organizational culture. It's the process of socialization that makes the culture of an organization come to life, or it's how we transfer culture in an organization from one generation to the next. Right, becomes a new employee, and that new employee has never worked at Cal Baptist. Well, it's going to take some time for you to learn the culture, learn how people are, the expectations of students, the expectations of colleagues, the expectations of staff, expectations about communication, expectations about our Christian worldview, and expectations about the Christian values, etc. You need some time to learn that, right? That's a learning process. Well, that learning process is known as socialization. Okay. Now, there's something else called the contingency approach to organizational design. What is this contingency approach to organizational design? This has all to do with uncertainty. It's managing uncertainty, and it's organizing or structuring your organization to meet the demands and the challenges that come with that uncertainty that is inherent in that industry or that arena or that country or that state. Okay, so it's tailored to the uncertainty around you. Okay, and so this is a very much a situational, risk management driven type of organizational approach. Okay. The success of an organization at the end of the day depends on how good its managers, its leaders are in taking into account and managing that uncertainty that the environment poses. Right? If you look at this slide, which is pretty neat here, you have a poor fit organization versus a close fit organization. Those organizations with a high degree of fit tend to be the ones that succeed, where the organization and the environment are very much interlapped, interconnected, well connected. They click. They adapt well to each other. On the other hand, those organizations that don't adapt well to each other, where, say, for example, the organizational culture just does not fit with the external environment's culture, then you end up with an organization that is constantly in tension and in fighting and creating forces against the external environment, and it's going to eventually fail. There's also another trade-off in the relationship between environmental uncertainty and organizational structure. So if we look at this slide, you see that depending on how high this environmental uncertainty is, we have high environmental uncertainty versus low. When an organization faces a low level of organizational uncertainty, of environmental uncertainty, a mechanistic structure tends to favor or tends to be the preferred type of structure, a much more mechanistic structure. This is a simple structure, very low differentiation, low integration, centralized decision making, and very standardized. So when there is little risk, little uncertainty, little unknowns in the environment, and everything is known, everything is laid out, everything is pretty much in the open, out in the open, and there are no risks, usually no competition, etc. A much more mechanistic structure tends to be appropriate. On the other hand, when you have high risk, okay, very uncertain environment, you depend on the ability of the organization to adapt. And so you need an organic structure. Organic in the sense that it's fungible. It can move back and forth. It can get smaller. It can get bigger. It can get flatter. Okay, so this calls for a complex structure, high differentiation, high integration, decentralized decision making, and mutual agreements where you give people the chance and the opportunities to be creative and to solve problems sometimes in their own way and not necessarily relying on standardization all the time. Okay, so this is the halftime here of the lecture. This concludes actually a little bit farther than halftime, but we end chapter 4. Now we go into chapter 5. And chapter 5 continues talking about some of these concepts. Let's start looking at designing an organizational structure. Okay, authority and control. All right. Very briefly, let me go through the objectives of this lecture. We explain why a hierarchy of authority emerges. Okay, the issues involved in designing a hierarchy to coordinate and motivate organizational behavior. Why? Understand the way which the design challenges discussed in Chapter 4, such as centralization and standardization, provides methods of control. Appreciate bureaucracy, the principles of bureaucracy and the bureaucratic structure. Explain the implications, and then explain why organizations are flattening their hierarchies and making more use of empowered teams of employees. Okay? So these are some of the concepts that you're going to study in Chapter 5. I won't cover all of these in this lecture, but I'll try and cover some of these, which are very important. So the first one is authority. Okay, how and why vertical differentiation occurs. Okay, and who has authority in an organization? All right. Usually it's the boss or the CEO or the manager or the owner, right? Um, so, how and why vertical differentiation occurs is based on authority. Okay, uh, the hierarchy begins to emerge when the organization experiences problems in coordinating and motivating employees effectively. This is um, this is usually a problem when you have a very vertical organization. Um, when when uh, when there is not a fluid communication between the top and the down, and the top and the bottom, and the upper management and the employees, you end up you start seeing the problems um, associated with hierarchy. Okay, um, and especially when it comes to motivation. When there is a disconnect between upper management and lower management, uh, or upper management, middle management, and the employees, the workers, you begin to develop problems of motivation. Okay, um, division in labor, division of labor and specialization make it hard to determine how well an individual performs. So, uh, it, when you divide, when you have a lot of division of labor and specialization, it's hard to determine, to compare. It's hard to assess. And so that is a potential challenge for organizations. Okay? So, to deal with coordination and motivation problems, what does the organization do? Well, it can increase the number of managers, right? To assign different people to manage different divisions, for example. It could also increase the number of levels, so the organization becomes flatter, right? So now you have more managers, more divisions, more levels. You have much flatter organization, and you have essentially now middle managers, and those managers are the ones directly responsible for leading those groups, and which also includes motivating and getting the most out of those employees. Size and height limitations. Okay, this also affects an organization. Uh, Tall organizations, all right, the hierarchy has many levels relative to the size of the organization, so it looks like a tall cone, all right. And then the flat organization, which has few levels, okay, in its hierarchy relative to its size, right? So when you hear about a flat organization versus a tall organization, this is what uh, they are referring to, okay? And here, let me show you in this graph. Flat versus tall organizations. You see a um, flat structure versus a tall structure. So, a tall structure, you're going to have a lot of levels, increasing the levels. Okay, whereas a flat structure, you have not as many levels, but you probably have more managers. It's flat. It's much more diversified, but you're going to have a closer communication. There's going to be a much closer communication between the top and the bottom than you would in a tall structure. Okay. What are some of the problems with tall hierarchies, for example? Well, you have obviously communication problems because it's obvious, right? The taller the organization, the more number of levels you have. So, um, information doesn't trickle down as effectively and as efficiently. So you have communication problems. You have motivation problems. It's been known in the literature and research and in practice that motivation is essential, and you need to have a direct personal relationship with somebody to to be motivated, right? If you have an absent boss, an absent manager, it's hard to get motivated by that person, right? or if you've never seen your CEO or the manager, the central manager or the general manager, it's hard to get motivated if you have never known that person, met that person, right? So it's harder to motivate people that you haven't seen or met or had some kind of a relationship with, and so taller organizations tend to have motivation problems. And there's also bureaucracy, the bureaucracy of the organization. You end up with bureaucratic costs, okay? Um, Many levels requires different people to approve things, and you have to coordinate different styles and ideas, and at some point you might have people disagreeing, and so all of this leads to waste of time and slower um, slower output or slower turnaround of your objectives, and so all of this leads to unnecessary bureaucratic costs. Span of control in an organization is another concept or another important element here. The you have different types of spans of control, right? And for example, if you have in the left, look at the left here in the left box, you have the CEO, and you might have these VPs, right, in yellow, and then underneath each of them, you might have two managers, right? So you have a very balanced span of control where the CEO is responsible for, or the CEO has communication with 6 individuals, actually 5 individuals here, 5 little balls, right? So 5 of the managers. So the CEO has communication with 5 managers, and those 5 managers each communicate with 2 assistant managers or 2 employees, as they are described here. So in this type of organizational structure, you're going to find perhaps less problems of people getting into each other's way. You're going to find a lot more consensus. You're probably going to find an organization that runs smoother because each of these managers only has to manage and lead and communicate to 2 individuals. And the CEO is at least in principle, can expect that his or her views and ideas and guidance is likely to be much closer or much closely transferred to the employees than if the organization followed, say, a span of control like B. Why is that? Well, the reason for it is because if you look at B, you have a CEO who now communicates with manager A and manager B. But manager A only has 2 individuals under her control, and manager B has, I don't know, 8 maybe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? So in this case, while the CEO only has to deal with 2 individuals, but the individual B, manager B, now has to manage 8 individuals. So the likelihood of that team of 8 or those individuals under team B, the chances of them being able to define tasks, assign activities, assign roles without getting into each other's way, without coming into friction, there's much more of a likelihood that those things will occur in a team like B than there is in a team like A. So spans of control are very important in organizations because they also tend to, well, they provide the the communication mechanisms by which a manager or a CEO or a boss is able to communicate her vision or his vision to the levels underneath. So there should be a limit to how wide a manager's span of control should be. Okay, so as I was saying, if the span is too wide, the manager loses control over the subordinates and can't hold them. Okay, um, and if the span is too short or too narrow, okay, then you might end up with maybe inefficiency. Okay, um, or you might end up with say a situation where you are trying to complete a task. Well, here the manager will be able to hold the worker accountable, but the upper management or the upper leadership will have they themselves will then have a hard time holding the individuals at the bottom accountable. Okay, because if you divide up a task into 5 different divisions, and each of those divisions have a manager. Well, and they are all working in concert, all working jointly. Um, who do you hold accountable, right? If one division is the one that caused the problem, but it's all in concert, it's everybody working together. It's hard to hold one division accountable when you have uh, so um, now, the increased complexity of a manager's role and the span of control increases. So look at if we see here, um, this might look similar, but it's actually it increases the complexity, and it leads to a lot more potential for things going wrong. Okay, and why is that? Well, look at what happens here. We just have 3 individuals, right? So you have a manager, and then you have 2 individuals at the bottom. Here, the communication goes from manager to worker, and then in between the workers. Okay, but look what happens when you add just one more person. Okay, with the addition of just one more worker, now you have 3 workers. Now instead of uh, having to manage 3 relationships, because you're managing your relationship with the 2 individuals plus their relationship, now you're having to manage 6 relationships. Okay, it's pretty incredible how just adding one person has now doubled the amount of management requirement that a person has to have now because of the span of control. And so these are some of the things we have to be aware of and concerned about when designing an organization. How big should our span of control be, or how short, how narrow should it be? Okay, these are some things that managers need to take into account. Okay, what are some of the factors affecting the shape of the hierarchy? Well, uh, obviously standardization. Okay, managers can gain control over employees by standardizing their behavior to make their actions predictable. So, uh, if you standardize, it reduces risk. Okay, it reduces the need for too much control. Okay, or adding levels of hierarchy. So, because it's almost like you've set out the path, you've set out the work, and so you don't need to be on top of people. You just say, hey, here they are. This is the standard. This is how we do things here. Just follow the rules, and you will be fine. So standardization allows managers to gain more control. All right, switching gears now. Uh, Bureaucracy. We've heard of the word bureaucracy probably in the past at some point. And when we think about bureaucracy or the bureaucracy, or when we hear bureaucratic, or when we hear something to be referred as bureaucratic, we often think that it's a negative thing because we associate it with organizations that are slow, that are cumbersome, that are not effective, that are not efficient. And yes, there might be some of that, but it's not a fair, complete definition of the word bureaucracy, because the word bureaucracy, in fact, the concept designed by, or introduced, I should say, by the great sociologist Max Weber. And what Weber was describing was the organization and the interrelationship of an organization, and how an organization was designed, and the value that would come about from the bureaucracy. Okay, so bureaucracy is a form of organizational structure in which people can be held accountable. Okay, what's wrong with that, right? Holding people accountable, isn't that what we want, right? Especially in government. So bureaucracy is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, what are some of the advantages of bureaucracy? Well, ground rules. If you look at these advantages, I'm going to point out a few words here. It lays out the ground rules. Okay, efficiently. Okay, so the word efficiently or efficiency. Uh, each person's role. So everybody has a role. Okay, these are clearly spelled out. Okay, held accountable, written rules, okay, reward, punishment, okay, and reduce costs. So if you think about all these words, reward, punishment, reduce costs, efficiency, clearly established or clearly spelled out roles, all of this is positive. All of this is something that's desirable, because we want this in organizations. We want this in, for example, in government. Okay, so when we think about the public sector and the administrative state, we obviously think about it sometimes as being very bureaucratic, but in a good sense, it's because it requires all these tasks to be conducted at the same time, and it does require us to be held accountable. Who do we owe the concept of bureaucracy? We owe it to Max Weber. Okay, um, and if we think about Weber, we again often think about, especially in public administration, when you think about him, you might think about him as one of the founders of organizational design, organizational theory. Taylor, Fayol, Weber. Okay, these are the great sociologists and the great scholars who are responsible for much of organizational theory. Okay, Weber. When you read his work, you see that he was very much a fan. Very much, he was fascinated with organizations. Okay, he said that the great virtue of bureaucracy, is defining characteristic, was that it was an institutional method for applying general rules to specific cases, thereby making the actions of government fair and predictable. So it's a way that you could apply general rules to specific cases. So think about the dynamic and the dimensions of society in the U.S., right? We have 350 million people, 50 states, many different demographics, many different people, many different all sorts of needs. How do you manage? How do you answer the needs of all these individuals uh, without trampling on anybody and meeting everybody's needs, but doing it efficiently, or at least as efficiently as possible? The only way to do it is through a bureaucratic organizational design. But of course, it's not perfect, right? Far from it. There are some problems that are associated with bureaucracy. For example, uh, managers fail to properly control the development of the organizational hierarchy. Okay, so what happens is, well, some of the members rely too much on rules and standards, too much on the set norms, the way that things are done, right? So think about it. If you might have heard the idea that somebody says, well, this is the way things have been done. This is the way things are done here. And this is the way we do things. And this is the way we will continue to do things. Well, that's what happens with organizations and bureaucracies. Weber always said that bureaucracies are like they are resistant to change. They are kind of like those jackets that they put on people that are not sane, right? They It's a straitjacket. They Organizations are very much like that. They want rules. They depend on rules. They prefer stability and the old ways instead of change. And so the problem with bureaucracy is that this over reliance to the way things were done and have been done, this over reliance to traditional ways and to the rules and to all of these requirements tends to make them less responsive or unresponsive to the changing needs of the environment. And this is the biggest setback of bureaucracy, that it may lead to an organization that is not able to adapt to the differences and the constantly changing environment that it finds itself in. Okay, and of course, last but not least, not forget the influence of the external environment and the informal organization. Okay, because when we think about organizations, and I'll leave you with this picture in your mind. Think about an organization as an iceberg. Okay, so if you think about an iceberg and picture an iceberg in your head, you see that there's a big chunk of the rock sticking out of the water. Well, think about that big chunk of rock sticking out of the water as the formal organization. But that big chunk of rock that sticks out of the water, when you look at an iceberg completely, the big chunk is just the top, just the peak, just a little part of this gigantic, humongous rock that sits underneath the surface. So what we see at the top is just a little peak, but the rock itself is huge, which means the informal organization is what's underneath the surface. So if you think about this analogy, think about that in an organization, 75% of what happens in an organization, of how things get done, of the communication, of how hierarchy and leadership and influence takes shape. Most of it happens underneath the surface. Okay, most of it happens informally and not through the formal channels. And so the informal organization is extremely important, and we as individuals that study and work in an organization need to understand what are those informal channels, what are those informal elements, or that informal culture that the organization operates under. Because if we are unaware of that and we don't know that, we may not survive in the organization, or the organization may not succeed, because it's those that informal structure that actually give that organization its value added or its uniqueness, right? It's these things that are very unique of that organization that other organizations don't have and can't see, but it's there. Okay? All right. So I hope you enjoyed this very long lecture. I apologize, but it was a lot of material. Again, thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the week, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.